Welcome to the Intrusions Indepth podcast. This is Josh Stepp. This is the first episode of a multi-part series in which we are diving into the shadowy world of hacktivism, surveillance tools, and vigilantes. It's a place where the line between hero and villain often blurs, where these tools can be used for good or bad. In this series, we're talking about the curious case of Phineas Fisher, a hacktivist who's been responsible for many cyber attacks starting in 2014 with Gamma Group, which, unironically, is where we're starting today. But before we do that, let's not get sued.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
Our story begins not with the Lambo-driving criminal or state-sponsored APT team, but a lone attacker operating under the pseudonym Phineas Fisher. In 2014, Phineas Fisher undertook an audacious cyber attack against Gamma Group, a company known for selling surveillance tools to some of the most oppressive regimes around the world. Phineas Fisher's motivation wasn't money, it wasn't fame, it wasn't a deep-seated belief in justice. Their goal was simple: expose the inner workings, burn the tools, and embarrass a company whose products were used to spy on activists, journalists, and dissidents. This was hacktivism. Now, in this episode, we'll look at the evolution of Gamma Group's surveillance tools, as well as claims brought against them by Citizen Lab, a human rights advocacy organization at the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. After that, we'll unravel the steps that Phineas Fisher took in his operation. I'll explore the TTPs, the tools, techniques, and procedures used in the Gamma Group attack and the manifesto left behind. Finally, I'll close with a discussion on the ramifications of the attack, as well as some thoughts on hacktivism and reflections on the Vice interview. Now, before I get started, I want to acknowledge the work and reporting of others. Without the research and reporting from Citizen Lab, Lorenzo Franceschi Bicciari, I'm sorry if I butchered that name, Joseph Cox, the entire Vice motherboard crew, Catalin Capano, and whoever that was voicing the puppet, this episode and future episodes wouldn't be possible. So I just want to say thank you. Gamma Group's a technology company that sells surveillance software to police forces and governments around the world. However, organizations like Citizen Lab have accused the company of selling these tools to oppressive, undemocratic regimes like those of Egypt and Bahrain, where the tools were used not against criminals, but civilians to squash their civil rights. On July 25, 2012, Citizen Lab published their first report on the use of FinSpy, a component of the PhineasFisher intrusion kit sold by Gamma Group, being used on pro-democracy Bahrainians by their government. Titled From Bahrain with Love, Morgan Marquise Bior and Bill Marzak, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced those, thoroughly pants this operation done by FinSpy. Now, at the time, FinSpy only targeted computers, and I want to highlight some of the key details from this report, but not get in the weeds, as we need to discuss other reports and the FinSpy evolution in whole. Now, in this attack on these activists, the initial entry came through a malicious attachment from an email address that claimed to be an Al Jazeera correspondent using a Gmail account. It turns out that this name of the correspondent was an actual person, but it wasn't from like a .aljazeera.com or something like that. Now, it's easy to assume that this user should have spotted this, but there's two things to consider. One, that this was 2012 and phishing training and awareness wasn't what it is today. And two, this would probably still get people today. Let's be real about it. Now, in these emails, the entity claimed that they had documents and pictures to help their cause. Even a suspicious user wouldn't think much about opening JPEGs or image files from an email. The docs may be a little suspicious. However, these files did a nasty little trick. They employed the use of a right-to-left character to hide their true nature. The RLL character controls the positioning of characters flowing from right to left for languages like Arabic or Hebrew. Just for context, RLO stands for right-left override, and it's a character used to change how it's displayed on screen. Now, in this example, the files or the malware would appear as a JPEG with the Windows icon for a picture file, but the thumbnail would be missing. So for example, if it was exe.erawlam.jpg, it would show up as a picture, but if you reversed it with the right-left override, it would be gpj.malware.exe. It's just spelled backwards. But obviously, this isn't a JPEG file anymore. This is an executable. Once that fake image was clicked on by a user, the files would open an image to give some inclination that it's working and it's doing as you would expect. But it also drops some files to harvest data, maintain persistence, and give a keyboard command of full control of the system covertly. This is pretty clever, even by today's standards. Ultimately, Citizen Lab was able to tie this to the PhineasFisher kit and Gamma Group through the use of a string found in a memory dump. The string contained the words finspyv4.01/finspyv2/. So that's pretty conclusive, you could say. Now, this may sound trivial, and probably by today's standards it is. This was 2012, and memory forensics wasn't as robust as it is today, and this wouldn't have been easy to detect if you didn't know about this technique or be tipped off that the thumbnail was missing from the JPEG. This sample also did a few other novel things. For example, it would check to see if it was being debugged, and then it would have code in it to crash commonly used debuggers. That's some annoying crap. Move. Additionally, it would use a custom packer to hide its code, which can make things hard to analyze. Usually, getting stuff out of a packer can be extremely difficult. However, through the discovery of those strings in memory, similar uses of the packer and domains discovered, tiger.gammainternational.de and ffdemoblog.dns.org, Citizen Lab was able to tie the software back to Gamma Group's PhineasFisher kit. Now, this report got attention from other security researchers and organizations, and this led to more analysis of PhineasFisher and a way to fingerprint the FinSpy command and control servers. These are the servers that the implants would reach back to and talk to. However, as you can imagine, snooping on someone's computer would be valuable, but the computer everyone carries in their pockets is probably a better target. Well, Gamma Group didn't leave that portion of the market hollow. They had an offering as well called FinSpy Mobile that supported iOS, Android, Windows Mobile, BlackBerry, and Symbian platforms. Symbian is like a Nokia operating system. Now, in the report titled "The Smartphone Who Loved Me, PhineasFisher Goes Mobile," Citizen Lab concluded that samples that they were sent was in fact FinSpy Mobile, a component of the PhineasFisher kit, based on brochures from the company explaining the product's capabilities. This is a quote from the report. Promotional literature describes the product as providing recording of common communications like voice calls, SMS, MMS, and messages, live surveillance through silent calls, file downloads of like the contacts, the calendars, pictures, and files, country tracing of the target, GPS and cell ID, full recording of all BlackBerry Messenger communications, and covert communications with headquarters. Now, in addition to these samples, we were conducting an ongoing scan for the PhineasFisher CNC servers and have identified potential servers in the following countries: Bahrain, Brunei, the Czech Republic, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Mongolia, Singapore, the Netherlands, Turkmenistan, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. End quote. More on those command and control servers in a moment. There was some other telltale signs in the malware sample that kind of led them to this conclusion as well. For example, in the iOS variant, the macro binary install_manager had the text FinSpy in it, as well as various other references within the binary. Furthermore, the developer certificate used to sign it belonged to Martin Munch, who happened to be the managing director of Gamma International and head of the PhineasFisher portfolio, according to the New York Times. By today's standards for mobile malware, especially on iOS, this would be extremely crude. The strings are sloppy, and Apple alerts you whenever apps are making calls to functions to snoop on your communications. But then again, I think mobile security has been one of the success stories in this industry. They have scale to solve problems, and as the rising rewards for exploits seem to go up, that would suggest that it's harder to find them. Plus, the teams at Google and Apple pay attention to odd crash dumps and the telemetry they see. Google Project Zero has pieces quite often about observed in the wild Android and iOS exploits, and some of those exploit chains are extremely complex. Speaking of Android, what's interesting about this sample weren't so much the technical aspects of the malware, It largely did the same thing as the iOS spyware, stole SMS, tracked the phone, etc., etc. But it was the domain that the malware reached out to as part of the command and control. demo.de.gammainternational.de and ff-demo.blogdns.org, which suggests that these are used for demos to prospecting customers. And samples similar to those spoke to servers in the United Kingdom and Czech Republic. Now, in an attempt to keep this episode manageable and not turn it into a technology archaeology podcast, I'm going to gloss over the Windows, BlackBerry, and Symbian implants. Essentially, they all did the same thing with the same capabilities as the Android and iOS cousins. They snooped on SMS, stole information, tracked the users. Now, some of them were observed going to the demo servers as well, which implies that they were to showcase capabilities to customers. Business was good for Gamma Group. What Citizen Lab and Rapid7 found, included at the bottom of this report, was more of the issue. Gamma Group, like I have stated earlier, claimed to only sell this software to governments and law enforcement, essentially the good guys. So it was cool for them to violate the moral right and wrong, as the people it would be used on were the bad guys, or at least some argument similar to this. Which on the surface, I guess sounds good to people. I mean, let's be real about it. I hate it. It's always more important to ask, who is judging these people as good and bad guys? Would we be okay if a bad guy or a bad regime got to make these determinations? If the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't support it. But hey, I'm just some dude on a self-funded podcast talking about a hacker who conducted an interview through a puppet. And more on that puppet in a minute. Anyway, this brings us to the last Citizen Lab article I want to discuss, and it highlights the true issue with this spyware, where it was used, and who the victims were. But first, let's lay some context around it. So depending on where you live, primarily if you live in what is called a Western society, then most likely the use of these tools on citizens by the government or other parties would be illegal. Illegal in most states or close to illegal. I know we have some edge cases you could argue, like one-party wiretapping, FISA warrants, normal warrants, or terms of service, etc., etc. But more likely than not, it's illegal in those societies. It's a blatant violation of someone's privacy, especially if they don't know that they're being monitored. Morally, I think we would all agree, or most people would, that is, that it's wrong and violates people's right to privacy in general. However, other countries are not so generous with these rights, and thus it may be a case of lawful, figuratively speaking, of course, but awful. Adding to this issue is that these tools are often used by governments that oppress their people and target opposition. So what usually happens is that companies say that they will only sell this software to governments, law enforcement, and people like that. They also tend to avoid the big players who are often sanctioned anyway. Countries like Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, the usual suspects. But there's also still plenty of impressive regimes out there stomping on people's privacy all day or monitoring opposition's movements with law enforcement agencies. Still typically frowned upon. So the last Citizen Lab report I want to discuss is titled, You Only Click Twice, PhineasFisher's Global Proliferation. By this time, Gamma Group has been exposed. Rapid7, Citizen Lab, and numerous other organizations have figured out how to fingerprint these servers used to command and control the FinSpy implants, the spyware. The result of this mapping of their servers and their uses was that the software was not being used to target criminals like murderers or thieves or something along those lines, but instead opposition to those in power. In other words, politically motivated targeting. Additionally, new samples were found in places like Vietnam, the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, Australia, and Japan. This is a quote from the article. Quote, We have found command and control servers for FinSpy backdoors, part of Gamma's International's FinSpy remote monitoring solution, in a total of 25 countries: Australia, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Brunei, Canada, Czech Republic, Estonia, Ethiopia, Germany, India, Indonesia, Japan, Latvia, Malaysia, Mexico, Mongolia, Netherlands, Qatar, Serbia, Singapore, Turkmenistan, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, United States, Vietnam. End quote. I feel like I'm playing Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego now. Anyway, that's quite a few Western governments on this list. Now, it's important to note that although the servers were found in these countries, it isn't a smoking gun per se that they were using the PhineasFisher kit in those countries. Back to the politically motivated targeting. The two samples here, one in Ethiopia and one in Vietnam, were noteworthy because it showed how the governments of those nations were using the software on undoubtedly opposition parties. Let's start with the Ethiopian one. Like the Bahrainian sample earlier, this used pictures of members of a group called Jimbot7, an opposition party, as a way to trick the user into thinking that the files were just photos. They were benign. Now, Jimbot7 was, at the time, recently declared a terrorist organization by the Ethiopian government, which was a move that was criticized by the organization Human Rights Watch. Full disclosure, I don't know too much about Ethiopian politics or why this happened along the lines. I'm just kind of going by what the report said and substantial research from Human Rights Watch. So this could be biased, and maybe there's rightful reasons to put them on a terrorist list. With that being said, the active sample that was found, as well as an active server in Ethiopia, it's fair to assume that FinSpy was being used. Vietnam also had active servers, and this Android sample was communicating with them. Furthermore, Citizen Lab found a config file that gave options like phone logs on, SMS on, tracking on, call interception off, which kind of removes all the doubt of the purpose of this software. Now, as pointed out in the article, this was noteworthy because Vietnam had recently passed a censorship law against those that spoke out against the current regime. This led to 17 bloggers being arrested and 14 of them being convicted and sentenced to prison, ranging from 3 years to 13-year sentences. And this is not for murder or theft or violent crimes, for blogging. Citizen Lab has been at the forefront of exposing these abuses, highlighting the dark side of surveillance technology and the commercialization of offensive tools. They've also published another report that I wanted to call out, For Their Eyes Only, Surveillance as a Service, in which they fingerprint more servers used by Gamma Group, more samples of FinSpy, in 11 new countries using the tooling, or at least hosting the servers. I didn't include it in this episode as I felt like I made my point into why Gamma Group and companies like Gamma Group were getting attention, and one of those paying attention was Phineas Fisher.
It's Phineas Fisher, yeah, I'm back in the scene. A hacker on a mission, disrupting the machine. Hacking team took him down with finesse. For the rules and the truth, man, you know I confess. With the Citizen Lab, saw the messed up report. Fisher and the others, just a crooked cohort. I don't do it for the fame, not for the glory. Just to give the targets a break, that's my story.
Phineas Fisher is a pseudonym of an individual or a group that claimed responsibility for the attack that dumped 40 gigabytes of information detailing Gamma Group's client list, price list, source code, details about the effectiveness of the PhineasFisher malware, user and support documentation, and a list of classes and tutorials for users to take. But what made this unique was that we had a detailed walkthrough or a guide from the attacker on how they did the operation, as well as commentary around their methodologies. It was also written in a text stock with ASCII art that kind of brings back memories of the IRC flame wars of old. And I can't emphasize how unique and useful this is. Usually you have to wait for a company or an incident response firm or an organization like the CSRB to provide detailed analysis of the incident based off piecing together forensic artifacts left behind. What Citizen Lab had to do with the FinSpy analysis, or what the CSRB did with Microsoft. Shameless plug for my previous episode you should listen to. However, Phineas Fisher's guides were different, a sort of manifesto. Their guides aimed to help people learn to hack these organizations and encourage people to use the tool of hacking to expose those in power. Now, before we go through this guide, I feel like I need to lay out some caveats here. First, Doing this to individuals or corporations without permission is illegal. Cyber Fraud and Abuse Act charges are no joke here in America. Your mileage may vary abroad, but that is your choice, and I would highly discourage you from doing so. Secondly, while these TTPs will still work in some organizations, modern IT infrastructure has changed. In some ways, it's more complicated since introducing the cloud. That's not to say that these are useless today, but the individual tools and procedures are different. The methodology is largely the same. On a personal note, these guides and the videos released for other hacks from Phineas Fisher were valuable to me, as I was much earlier in my career. Being exposed to a guide for a real-life attack filled in holes in my understanding of how offensive acts were carried out. And they're funny, which is always a good thing. The first section dealt with operational security and how they hid their identity. It's a little boring for our purposes, but ironically, usually this is what gets people caught. I'll summarize for you. The first rule of being a black hat hacker is to not talk about being a black hat hacker. It's the Fight Club rule. Furthermore, using a dedicated computer, not your personal Wi-Fi, and using an encrypted volume like TrueCrypt, or if it was today, Baracrypt, is obviously a great idea. Now, as a defender, this part isn't that useful as we rarely have insight into the attacker's computer, but the next part is something that you still see often. Multiple IP addresses or domains used during a campaign. Phineas Fisher outlines the reason why here with this quote. Note, I do not recommend actually hacking directly over Tor. While Tor is usable for some things like web browsing, when it comes to using hacking tools like Nmap, SQLmap, and Nikto that are making thousands of requests, they will run very slowly over Tor. Not to mention that you'll want a public IP address to receive connections back from shells. I recommend using servers you've hacked or a VPS, virtual private server, paid with Bitcoin to hack from. That way, the only low bandwidth text interface between you and the server is over Tor. All the commands you're running will have a nice fast connection to your target. End quote. In other words, going over Tor is slow and makes communications from the reverse shells extremely difficult. Shells, implants, their malware, whatever you want to call it, from an attacker interacts with the system once it's been compromised. The term reverse shell is used as it originates communication back to the attack infrastructure from the infected machine. Traffic going to an endpoint behind a firewall, switches, routers, proxies, etc. have multiple defenses to get through. Traffic going out has less obstacles and is usually scrutinized less. Granted, it blends in, of course. So this is why it isn't uncommon to have multiple malicious domains and IP addresses. Some may be Tor exit nodes, which you can usually find pretty quick with the list online, or figure out quickly during triage. Tor being a system in which traffic is bounced around between nodes as a way to obscure the user. But there are also usually public IP addresses as well, since they're better for shells as mentioned in the manifesto and won't set off any rules if your network is designed to detect Tor traffic. And as a part of their OPSEC, Phineas Fisher lays out using servers you hacked or virtual private servers paid for with Bitcoins. Now remember this for the next episode. I'll remind you for it as well. The idea is that you don't want to use your AWS EC2 free instance with your first.lastname@gmail.com email address as your account for your criminal activities. It's the 2024 version of always in cash, never in writing. But I've droned on about this for long enough. I don't want to create a 2-hour podcast on how to be a terrible criminal. Now, the next part of the manifesto describes the methodology behind mapping targets, which admittedly probably is the most important but the least sexy part of being a hacker. Swordfish would have sucked if it was just Hugh Jackman running a bunch of Nmap scripts for the first 2 hours of the movie. Granted, Phineas Fisher was using Fierce to do this, but the tools don't matter. Remember that. After getting a list of domains, they would then pivot to doing a whois lookup and finding where websites were hosted. The lookup retrieves information about the domain name, the registrant, including the registrant's contact details, domain registration date, expiration date, and the domain's current status. Then you can take this information, use it to do a reverse whois lookup, which is kind of its own service and costs money. But the next best thing is Google dorking it, providing the similar results using the NURL tools within Google. Now, as Phineas Fisher points out, this is usually where it pays to take your time, as the larger the attack surface that you know about, the easier it is to find a hole. And this also brings me to a point that is often stated that drives me crazy that I want to touch on for a second. And that's the notion that the attacker only has to be right once and the defender can only be wrong once, or something along those lines, as it's often stated. Anyone that's ever done any sort of offensive activities knows that that is completely wrong. The attacker needs to be right multiple times, all while evading EDR, canaries, detections, and other things that they don't fully know about. Let's think about this in like a different scenario, in that you're protecting your house and there's an attacker trying to get in, but you left one of the windows in the basement unlocked. The hacker opens up the basement window, gets in there, and they're in your basement. Now, could this be a problem? Absolutely. There could be a door directly into your house. There could be a bunch of tools down there. You could just, and have all your important gold in your basement. So yes, this could be a problem. They get in there and they move out. But more than likely, they're going to need to move to a different part of the house to have any sort of effectiveness. And from a defender standpoint, chances are whatever's in the basement isn't that important because it's locked in the basement. So while it's not great to have some random person you don't know in your basement, it's usually not the end of the world. Now, pivoting back to the attacker, we need to figure out a way to get into the house. But we don't know if the defenders already know that we're there. We don't know what's on the other side of that door. And with things like canaries and canary tokens, it's all kind of a landmine as well, because now there's 10 doors that could lead upstairs, but you don't know which one's going to ring a bunch of bells to the police department, or you don't know which hammer you can touch to use to break in, because you don't know if that's also a bell that's going to the police department. Now, I know this doesn't map one-to-one, but it gives you an idea of kind of what's going through an attacker's head the entire time they're trying to penetrate a network. Now, obviously, if I'm talking about them on this podcast, the network probably wasn't well defended, but that's definitely not the case here in 2024. But going back to this house analogy and like the 10 doors and everything else, with things like I mentioned earlier, the canaries and canary tokens, seeing a .aws file on a web server may look like a juicy target, because that means you could get into like an AWS environment. You would have access depending on whatever that user has. And there could be more information stored in like S3 buckets or something like that that would help you. But it's also like an AWS file on a web server. So it's like, well, who does that? So you're constantly kind of battling the need of looking at a juicy target versus, is this something here to trick me? Or you could just run into like the jigsaw of defenders, and they actually have an AWS environment set up solely to trick people to log into. And once you log into, it's like, hey, the jig's up and we know someone's in our network, or we know someone's at least accessing these files. So all of this is to say that, like, sure, the attacker does have to be right once to get in, but they still have an objective and they still need to be right multiple times, all while not knowing the network, trying to avoid detection, being paranoid that they've already been detected, and more importantly, having to look up things and learn things on the fly, which you'll hear Phineas Fisher talking about, and the possibility that sometimes you fail at things. Anyway, let's get back to the Gamma Group attack. After being armed with the terrain map of Gamma Group's externally facing network, Phineas Fisher began footprinting the various hosts to determine which ports are open and which services they had running. Knowing this information, you could potentially throw exploits at a vulnerable service and get behind the firewall that way. Let's focus on each service you find running. I'm going to paraphrase some of the manifesto with adding some additional details. This is from the manifesto. Is a service exposing something it shouldn't? Sometimes companies have services running that don't require any authentication. They assume it is safe because the URL or IP to access it isn't public. But what you may discover is a get subdomain through a tool like Fierce. You might find that you can access something like get.companyname.com/getweb and browse their source code. Now, going back to present day, in the past, this used to be true of like Amazon S3 buckets and searching for open buckets with troves of information in them. Sometimes source code, legal contracts, customer data, etc. Back to the manifesto. Is the service horribly misconfigured? Maybe they have an FTP server that allows anonymous read or write access to an important directory. Open Telnet? Or perhaps they have a database server with a blank admin password. Phineas Fisher also mentions that the sad truth of embedded devices, like voice over IP boxes, IP cameras, or routers, that may still be using a manufacturer's default password, which you could still find on the internet today. Now, these things don't get updated that often, as they're usually in obscure places. Also, you need to be able to ask yourself, is it running an old version of the software, and is it vulnerable to a public exploit? For web servers, Phineas Fisher gives a blueprint on how to exploit them, as well as browsing to the domain and using a tool like Nikto to scan for misconfigurations, or look for some other tools designed to exploit popular CMSs like WordPress or Joomla. Now, back to the manifesto, Phineas Fisher points out that if it's custom coded, potentially there could be more bugs, but unless it's hosted as like open source, you have to devote time to finding a bug for it. And this is how Phineas Fisher got into the support page for Gamma Group. Phineas Fisher targeted the domain finsupport.phinefisher.com. Now, quoting from the manifesto, for finsupport.phinefisher.com, the process was start Nikto running in the background, visit the website, see nothing but a login page, quickly check for SQL injection in the login form, see if WhatWeb knows anything about the software that the site is running. WhatWeb doesn't recognize it, so the next question I want to answer is if this is a custom website by Gamma or if there's other websites using the same software. I view the page source to find a URL I can search on. Index.php isn't exactly unique to the software, so I check the scripts folder for scripts.js.php and Google all in URL scripts/scripts.js.php. I find there's a handful of other sites using the same software, all coded by the same small web design firm. It looks like each site is custom coded, but they share a lot of code. So I hack a couple of them to get a collection of the code written by the web design firm. At this point, I can see the news stories that journalists will write to drum up views. In a sophisticated multi-stage attack, hackers first compromised a web design firm in order to acquire confidential data that would aid them in hacking Gamma Group. But it's really quite easy, done almost on autopilot once you get the hang of it. It took a couple of minutes to Google in URL scripts/scripts.js.php and find the other sites. Notice that they're all SQL injectable in the first URL parameter I try. Realize that they're running Apache mod security, so I need to use SQL map with the option tamper equals tamper mod security version.py. Acquire the admin log information, log in and upload a PHP shell. The check for allowable file extensions was done client-side in JavaScript, and download the website source code. Now, once they got their hands on the source code, it appeared to be a target-rich environment filled with SQLi, or SQL injection, LFI, local file inclusion, and client-side JavaScript checks for file uploads. Now, let's step back for a minute. Client-side JavaScript checks for file uploads is considered a bad idea, as you rely on code from the client, the browser, to determine the types of files allowed to be uploaded, and thus this isn't in your control as the website's owner. So, like in this case, an attacker can upload a payload as a file using the support portal, and bam, they got a shell. Next up, they're getting root. Phineas Fisher made a claim that most Linux servers could be privilege escalated using some common tools at the time. I'm inclined to take their word on it, as I don't have much experience in attacking things. However, nowadays, sysadmin pay more attention to their Linux machines and the security posture than 10 years ago. After trying a cron job to privilege escalate to root with no luck, and the OS being a new Debian instance, Phineas Fisher gave up on getting root and decided to pivot to another machine. Now, once inside, Phineas Fisher used the same process for mapping, fingerprinting, and moving within the internal network of Gamma Group. One TTP that stood out from the manifesto, and a practice you often see, is attackers bringing their own tools with them. They still live off the land as well, but Phineas Fisher suggested bringing Nmap along with the SMB and NFS scripts. After going on another web server on the Fin support network, Phineas Fisher found a folder called QA Team in which their mobile malware was stored. Now, altogether, Phineas Fisher escaped with 40 gigabytes of data and dumped their torrent on Reddit. It was picked up, examined, and circulated through various subreddits and news outlets like Vice. And to add salt to the wound, they set up a Twitter handle called Gamma Group PR, in which they highlighted some of the more juicy items. A+ trolling. Now, the bulk of the dump items were sales papers, manuals for the malware, price lists, product lists, and there was a large GPG encrypted file that Phineas crowdfunded GPUs to try and crack. Now, as you can see or hear, that the cool, elite, sexy stuff of throwing exploits and getting shells is a very small part of the process. A lot of this is trial and error, all while trying to keep a low profile. You have to second guess every file you open. Is this .aws file for real, or is it just a canary? That in all actuality, it really comes down to mapping domains and trying to find boxes forgotten about on the network, or discovering a way to actually get a payload onto the system, which in the movies, they don't really highlight as it's very boring and tedious. Now let's talk about hacktivism more broadly for a moment. And warning, I'm going to open more threads here for you to think about, so let's explore this with an open mind. Now, hacktivism is a complex topic and hard to remain unbiased. It usually comes down to who the victims are and how you feel about them. If you hate the victim, it's the best thing ever. If you're sympathetic to the victim, it's a national emergency. Now, this isn't confined to just hacktivism. It's justice, air quotes here, altogether. Think of how divided people are on pivotal court cases like O.J. Simpson, for example, or more recently, the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, the groundbreaking Heard versus Stepp, the President Trump legal cases, or all the Hunter Biden lawfare. Or, for that matter, it's June 2024 when I'm recording this, the current conflict between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza. Each side is accusing the other of war crimes and trying to win the information warfare aspect of the conflict. Let's bring it back to hacktivism, as I think it's best to start with defining it. Hacktivism is defined by the Merriam-Webster Dictionary as computer hacking, as by infiltration and disruption of a network or website, done to further the goals of a political or social activist. Basically, we're combining the word activism with the word hack or hacker. As you'll notice, I tend to use the word cyber attack or attack instead of hack or hacker as a matter of semantics, but I think we all get the gist here. So why do people do this? It is illegal after all. In the Hackback Manifesto published by Phineas Fisher, I think the main goal is covered with this quote. I'm writing this to demystify hacking, to show you how simple it is, and to hopefully inform and inspire you to go out and hack stuff. Well, let's keep it family friendly. If you have no experience with programming or hacking, some of the text below might look like a foreign language. Check the resource sections at the end to help you get started. And trust me, once you've learned the basics, you'll realize this really is easier than filling out a FOIA request. End quote. One of the assertions to accompany this is from the interview with the news organization Vice, in which Phineas Fisher elaborated that they had read the Citizen Lab reports, thought it wasn't cool. In other words, I'm trying to keep this family friendly. And they did this to help the victims get some breathing room. There's more to this interview that I will cover in a moment, but this leads to one of the criticisms of hacktivism. It doesn't work, or it doesn't push the needle forward. I have mixed feelings on this. Sure, there's plenty of mobile spyware today, a decade after these attacks. Pegasus has been found everywhere, it seems, most recently in Poland. I'll circle back to this in a moment. Predator, another mobile spyware, has had its employees, executives, and its mother company sanctioned by the U.S. government after its software turned up on 2 sitting members of Congress. Like Gamma Group, these organizations, for example NSO Group, try to justify what they're doing and selling by saying, we only sell these to governments, or something similar to that, to make it sound like they're here to help the good guy, or whatever that means. But like hacktivism itself, it really depends on how you view the parties involved. Pegasus was found in Poland, being abused by the former government administration to target political opponents, or in other words, obstacles to the party staying in power. Which, unironically, in the same Vice interview, Phineas Fisher called out as a matter of how this software appears to be used. Quote, I'm a little confused by the question. I'm not sure why people are writing laws that would want to stop at companies whose job it is to help them enforce them. The essential function of law enforcement is the same in all the PhineasFisher and hacking team customers, where targets of the spying have been identified in Bahrain, Ecuador, Mexico, Ethiopia. It's all investigative journalists, dissidents, political opposition, etc., being targeted, never standard crime. The vast majority of law enforcement resources everywhere are dedicated to monitoring threats and those of power. In one of the rare glimpses into how police spend their resources in a democratic government, back before everything was on hard drives and you could just hack them in your pajamas, it was in a filing cabinet, and you had to physically break in. But when the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into their office, they found, according to its analysis of the documents in the FBI office, that 1% were devoted to organized crime, mostly gambling. 30% were manuals, routine forms, and similar procedural matters. 40% were devoted to political surveillance and the like, including 2 cases involving right-wing groups, 10 concerning immigrants, and over 200 on left or liberal groups. Another 14 of those documents concerned draft resistance and leaving the military without government permission. The remainder concerned bank robberies, murder, and interstate theft. Draft resistance and leaving the military all included under not real crime, but threats to those in power. So like 70% political, 30% real crime. The difference between authoritarian regimes and democratic ones is the hacking team customers jail, torture, and kill, whereas the democratic ones have gentler ways of managing dissent. End quote. That's a strong argument. And considering this came from a puppet, it's an odd feeling to be nodding your head in agreement with something that looks like a Sesame Street outlet toy. A+ to this puppeteer. Now, for added context, the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI incident was in the early 1970s, back when these activist groups had names that described what they do. The group released the documents to news organizations, and despite the FBI saying that releasing the documents would endanger agents, the Washington Post ran a front-page article about the document, and other news agencies followed suit. Eventually, all the documents were released, and we learned about COINTELPRO, which later led to the famous Church Commission. So, in an attempt to tie up these notions of whether hacktivism works, it depends on how you define the success criteria and who you call a hacktivist. Phineas Fisher feels like a good example of a hacktivist. Now, would we call the Lazarus Group one after they got Sony to pull the movie from The Interview? Shameless plug number 2 for my previous episode. I'm not sure that hurt anyone but movie theaters and actors' egos. The movie still came out eventually. People saw it. And I doubt it made anyone think, gee golly, those people sure did make the dictator who starves his own population, lobs rockets over Japan, and kills his defectors look like a terrible, silly person. More recent groups, like the Belarusian cyber partisans, seem to be conducting some impressive operations that would make things difficult under the guise of hacktivism. Could they be state-sponsored? Who knows? However, one person's hacktivist is another person's cybercrime. Or as President Ronald Reagan famously said concerning terrorism and freedom fighters, quote, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." That's a catchy phrase, but also misleading. Freedom fighters do not need to terrorize a population into submission. Freedom fighters target the military forces and the organized instruments of repression keeping dictatorial regimes in power. Freedom fighters struggle to liberate their citizens from oppression and to establish a form of government that reflects the will of the people. Now, this is not to say that those who are fighting for freedom are perfect, or that we should ignore problems arising from passion and conflict. Nevertheless, one has to be blind, ignorant, or simply unwillful to see the truth if he or she is unable to distinguish between those I just described and terrorists. Terrorists intentionally kill or maim unarmed civilians, often women and children, often third parties who are not in any way part of the dictatorial regime. Terrorists are always enemies of democracy. End quote. So who is the terrorist and who is the freedom fighter? Which one is illegal and which one's morally right? It's an interesting set of questions, and I don't have an answer for you, as I think this is something that you need to come to on your own. Phineas Fisher stated in response to being asked about what they do as being illegal and the actions of the surveillance companies being legal, and how they thought about it. Here's what they had to say. Well, yeah, that's true, but legal versus illegal is almost inversely proportional to right and wrong, though, end quote. And I think this is a good place to stop this installment. I'll give you some time to marinate on that thought. Phineas Fisher was just getting started with Gamma Group. On the next episode, we'll go into Hacking Team, the other surveillance company Phineas Fisher pwned sideways. And Hacking Team's postmortem is juicy. If you would like to hear more, visit the website at intrusionsindepth.com, where you'll find more stories on high-profile intrusions and the threat actors that conduct them. I'm Josh Stepp. Thanks for listening.
It's Phineas Fisher, yeah, I'm back in the scene. A hacker on a mission, disrupting the machine. Hacking team took him down with finesse. For the rules and the truth, man, you know I confess. Read the Citizen Lab, saw the messed up report. Finn Fisher and the others, just a crooked cohort. I don't do it for the fame, not for the glory. Just to give the targets a break, that's my story.
Anti-surveillance, yeah, that's my fight. Exposing all of that darkness, bringing it to light. Surveillance companies got no morals, it's true, but I'm a